Welcome to the second half of the course. In the first half, we talked about how the discovery of vaccines and antibiotics had significantly increased human life expectancy by reducing the number of deaths caused by infectious diseases. Now, in the second half of the course, we will be looking at other causes of death, as well as medical innovations that are available to reduce those number of deaths. Um, when someone, for example, has a heart failure or a diabetic patient has a failing kidney or someone has a failing liver, etc., and etc., they are not expected to live very long unless something like organ transplant can be done, and that's the topic of today's lesson. So in this lecture, we will be looking at the types of organ transplant that can be performed. Not every organ can be transplanted, but some can, and we will look at what those are. We will examine the technical challenges of organ transplant, as well as ethical issues related to organ transplant. So let's get started. Here are some true or false questions for you to consider before you watch the rest of the lecture recording. A signed donor card is all you need to become a donor. Is that true or false? I cannot be a donor because I have serious medical condition. Organ donation will delay and impact my funeral plans. I cannot donate blood, so I cannot be an organ donor. So I want you to take a moment and write down what you think about these statements. Do you think they're true or false? And we will come back to them. We'll revisit them at the end of the lecture. Let's begin with some basic science related to organ transplant. Here are some organ transplant statistics. Every year, many people die while waiting for an organ donation, and over 1,600 Canadians are added to the organ wait list every year. While 90% of Canadians support the idea of organ and tissue donation, only less than 20% have actually made plans to donate. It is also worth mentioning that one donor can benefit more than 75 people and save up to 8 lives under the optimal condition. So who needs to have a transplant? Well, usually transplant is not the first thing that people would try. Okay, other treatments are going to be attempted first. So things like medications, surgeries, other types of surgeries not related to transplant, changes to diet and lifestyle, all these things are going to be tried first. And if none of those work and the organ is failing, and there are no other good options, then organ transplant is the last resort for the person with a failing or with a diseased organ. Organ transplant in kids, for example, is usually due to some kind of birth defects in the heart. So in the heart, there are these valves that helps the blood flow in a one-way direction, and some birth defects can cause the valves to be defective, and so that's an example of where a child would need to have a heart valve transplant. In adults, it can be as a result of many different types of diseases, such as cancer, for example, or it's because of accumulated damage to the organ over time due to things like heart diseases, high blood pressure, or diabetes. But the point is, no one's going to try organ transplant as the first treatment option. It's always when you are out of options, and this is going to be the last resort. For some patients, transplant is a life-saving option, but it's not for everybody. Even though you have exhausted all other possible options, transplant might still not be suitable for you. And there are many things that needs to be taken into considerations. So take heart transplant, for example. It is not always considered beneficial for the patient who are over the age of 65. And if the patient has poor blood circulation, or if they are unwilling or unable to make the necessary lifestyle changes, to keep their donor heart healthy, then it might not be a good idea to perform the transplant surgery at all. You also have to see if the patient has another medical condition that is considered as a life-threatening. So, for example, if a person has a heart failure and they also has a failing kidney, then doing the heart transplant will not meaningfully extend the quality of life of the person, and it might not even meaningfully extend the life expectancy of the person, because even you fix the heart problem, there is also the imminent kidney failure problems that needs to be addressed. So all these things needs to be taken into consideration, before one can decide whether or not an organ transplant is going to be viable. Here is a list of organs that can be transplanted, things like liver, small bowel, kidneys, pancreas, heart, and lungs. And here is a list of tissue that can be transplanted. So things like cornea, which is the little convex covering of your eyeballs. There's skin, bone, cardiovascular tissues, cells of the pancreas, as well as connective tissues. It is also possible to do what's called vascularized composite allotransplantation, and that would mean multiple tissues are transplanted at the same time, including muscle and bones and nerve and skin. The whole thing is transplanted as a functional unit. So a hand transplantation is an example of this. Let's take a closer look at the organs that can be transplanted. So the lungs can be transplanted, and the major function of the lung is to allow gas exchange. Okay, so you breathe in oxygen and you breathe out carbon dioxide, and the lungs helps you do that exchange. And you can actually have a lung transplant from a diseased or living donor. So you can get a lungs from a person that has passed away, or from someone who is still living. Okay, so you can, as a living person, you can donate part of your lungs, and the remaining lungs that you have will be enough for the body function for the body to function properly. Common illnesses that require a lung transplant include things like COPD. Right? So you might have seen people have to carry an oxygen tank around with them in order to breathe. That usually is because of COPD, which stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, and for those people, they cannot breathe on their own, basically. So you would need to have lung transplant. There is also cystic fibrosis, which is a situation where fluid builds up in your lungs, and that could cause repeated infection. And so, you might need a new pair of lungs for that. Heart transplant. The heart function is to pump blood around the body, and because we only have one heart, so you can only do a heart transplantation if you have a diseased donor. And common illnesses that requires heart transplant would be congenital heart diseases. These are heart conditions that you are born with, damaged valves, as we mentioned before, and then coronary diseases. So on the surface of the heart, you have all these blood vessels that will supply the heart muscle with nutrients and oxygen. If they become blocked, then the person might have a heart attack. So there are other surgeries that could try to alleviate the problem. You might have heard of bypass surgeries, but you cannot keep on doing bypass surgery. Okay, so after double or triple bypass even, then the only other option is to get a heart transplant. The pancreas is located kind of behind your stomach on the left side of your abdomen, the upper left side of your abdomen. And its function is to make something called insulin, which helps you take up the sugar after you have a meal. and it also helps with the digestive process. There's only one pancreas, so you have to take it from a diseased person. And the common illnesses requiring a pancreas transplant would be something like diabetes. Small bowel is basically your small intestine, and the small bowel transplant replaces either a diseased or shortened small bowel with a healthy bowel from a donor. And the small bowel transplant is also considered when complication arises from something called the total perennial nutrition or TPN, or when a person is unable to tolerate this form of feeding. So what's TPN? Well, basically, because of underlying conditions, the person is not able to eat normally. So in TPN nutrition is where liquid nutrients are going to be given through drips, and it supplies all the daily nutritional requirements. The TPN can be used in hospital or at home. And for some people, this might be the only feasible option for providing nutrients, especially for people with a non-functioning GI tract. But the problem is well, first of all, the biggest problem is this is not an ideal way to live, right? It significantly reduces your quality of life. You basically can't eat anything, and you're just living on, a solution that, keeps you alive. And on top of that, 5 to 10 people, patients with TPN will actually have complications. Things like sepsis, which is infections in the blood, and more than 50% of patients would have sugar or glucose abnormalities or liver dysfunction. And in more than 90% of people, there are going to be some kind of complication related to this kind of feeding process. So it's really not ideal, and that's why small bowel transplant is needed for these patients. The next is liver, and liver is for cleaning blood, detoxifying the blood, and it also helps you store energy. So if you didn't eat breakfast, for example, your liver will be pumping out reserve energy for you to run on until you eat again. And even though we only have one liver, it's possible to donate part of the liver and be okay. So you can get it from both disease or living donors. And illnesses that require liver transplant include things like ongoing hepatitis, chronic hepatitis, as well as cirrhosis. So liver cirrhosis can be caused by, for example, alcohol abuse, where the liver is going to be scarred because it's trying to detoxify the alcohol constantly. You do have two kidneys, and their function is to clean the blood and create urine. Because you do have two kidneys, you can donate one and be perfectly fine. So you can get it from a disease or living person. And kidney failure as well as diabetes are common reasons of why someone would need to have a kidney transplant. As we saw in the previous slides, the donor can either be living or diseased, depending on which organ we're talking about. So for a diseased donor, it's actually a little bit tricky. Not everybody who passed away can have their organs donated or transplanted. Oh, well, first of all, you would need to have their consent before they die. But the more complicated issue is only 2 to 3% of hospital deaths occur in a way that allows for the donation to take place. And that's because if a person does not pass away on a ventilator, then the organs might not be suitable for transplant anymore, because after the person dies, the organs will not be receiving adequate blood flow, and the organ will start to degrade and die off as well. So, another example is if someone dies at home, by the time the body is retrieved, most of the organs would not be viable by that point, because there wasn't a ventilator to keep the oxygen kind of flowing in the body, right? So only 2 to 3% of deaths that occur in the hospital would be suitable for organ transplant if the person has given consent before. Tissue donation, on the other hand, is a little bit more versatile, more robust. The tissue can still be used if a person passed away in the hospital, but not on a ventilator, or even if they pass away at home. If they're able to retrieve the body and take it to the hospital, usually the tissues are still quite good for transplant. So how do you become an eligible deceased donor? Well, the Trillium Gift of Life Network is a non-profit agency of the Government of Ontario, and the agency is responsible for planning, promoting, coordinating, and supporting organ and tissue donation, as well as the transplantation itself across Ontario. Its mission, as stated on its website, is to save and enhance lives through the gift of organ and tissue donation and transplantation in Ontario. So in order to register as an organ donor or like tissue donor after you pass away, you have to be at least 16 years old. And in the registration process, you have to provide your date of birth as well as your health card number, and that's really all you need. If you are eligible, if you pass all these three points, the easiest way to do it is to go to beadonor.ca, the website, and there is a form for you to fill in. When I was preparing for this lecture a few years ago now, I wanted to see how easy it was to become a donor. So I went to beadonor.ca, and it literally took less than 2 minutes. And I just filled in the form, gave my date of birth, and then my health card number, and that was it. And the whole process, like I said, took less than 2 minutes, and then I became a registered donor. You can also register in person at any Service Ontario Centre, or you can, print off a form from the website that I gave you, and you can mail it to Service Ontario. So there are a lot more information on beadonor.ca, so go check it out if this is something that you are considering doing. Like I said at the beginning of the lecture, right? Most people, 90% of Canadians, are support the idea of organ or tissue donation after they pass away, but less than 20% have made plans to do it. So this is how you can make plan to do it, just by registering, and it's really quick and easy process. As we saw earlier, some organs like liver and kidneys can be donated as a living donor. Liver, for example, has remarkable regenerative capability, so it's possible to donate part of your liver, and some of it is going to regenerate. You can see in this picture, if you donate this much, then after 2 months, you're not going to get the whole liver back, but you will get some of it back, and that is more than enough for normal, healthy, regular functions. And in the case of kidneys, there are 2 in everybody, and so it's possible to donate 1, and the remaining kidney that you have is fully capable of maintaining normal body functions. Here are the various types of living donation. The most common one, I would say, is to donate to a blood relatives. Okay, so these are people who are actually related to you by blood. And so your parents, your children, siblings, so on and so forth. Naturally, you have a desire to save these people because they're the people who are related to you, and presumably you love them, and so you want to save them. But because they are also blood related to you, there's a higher chance that the organ is going to be compatible. So these type of donations are probably the most common. Another type is non-related donations. So these are situations where you want to donate to your spouse, to your partners, to your in-laws, close friends, and co-workers. While you might have the same incentive or same desire to save these people as blood relatives, you might not always have the right match. Okay, so you really want to save your spouse, right? Your wife or your husband or your partner, but because you two are not actually related by blood, then there is a high chance that the organ will not be a match for them. So there is that, medical challenge associated with that. The next type is paired exchange. If someone is willing to donate an organ, say it's one of their kidneys, but they were unable to donate it to their intended recipient due to incompatibility, then it's possible that the donor is willing to give the kidney to another totally unrelated matching person. Okay, and certainly some cases like that do happen. And the last one is perhaps the most altruistic, the most selfless act, which is anonymous. These donors are willing to donate to whoever is at the top of the transplant rating list, and in many cases, the recipient might never find out who their donor was. Let's look at some more statistics. On the vertical axis here, this represents the number of donors per million in the population. So for Canada, which is shown in this red line here, you can see there hasn't been much change from the year 2006 to 2015 in terms of the number of donors, and it seems Canadians are not particularly a leading country when it comes to donation. For example, Spain is doing a lot better than us, and the U.S. They certainly have more donors compared to us. Here are organs that are being transplanted most commonly, and you can see kidneys, which is this great line here, is the most common type of transplant, second by liver transplant, which is down here. This line at the top, this is the total number of transplants that were performed between the year 2006 and 2015. Here is the organ donor rates across Canada by regions, and this is data from 2018. These numbers again is per million population. So in Ontario, we are slightly above the national average. Okay, both in terms of disease donor rate as well as living donor rate. Let's look at the recipient's perspective. Okay, how do you become an eligible recipient, and how do you get on the waiting list? We will look at the process in Canada. So first, you need to be diagnosed with a condition that has no other treatment options. Then you will be referred to what's called a transplant clinic, where they will then assess your situation. They will take a look at your case and see if you are suitable to be a transplant recipient, a transplant candidate. Okay, so factors such as age, health conditions, medical history, they are all going to be assessed. If a person is too old, they might not even survive the transplant surgery. And people like if they are cancer patients, for example, they might not be suitable either. If the person has a history of a previous transplant rejection, or they have non-compliance to medical advice following the surgery, such as things like alcohol abuse and liver transplant, then they might not be suitable to have a transplant. So suitability rules are sometimes area of ethical debates. For example, in Utah, in the U.S., there was a 22-year-old man suffered from pneumonia, and the pneumonia caused both of his lungs to collapse, and he basically won't be able to breathe on his own without a double lung transplant. So he was, however, denying a transplant, even though there was a compatible donor, because he was tested positive for THC, which is something that you found in marijuana, and so he died shortly after that. The question is, should he been denied of the double transplant because he used marijuana before? That's going to be ethical debate, and we'll look at some arguments on both sides, from both sides later on. In Ontario, there was the case of Delilah Saunders, where in 2017 she was denied a liver transplant because she struggles with alcoholism. So, should an alcoholic be declined of a liver transplant? Remember, these people, if they don't get the liver transplant, they might die from the illness very shortly. So, we will discuss some of these things when we get to the ethical section of the lecture. So once the person is assessed for suitability and they're deemed suitable for the transplant, they will be placed on the waiting list. When an organ becomes available in Ontario, there is actually a complex computer program that uses things like blood type, age, body size, genetics, medical severity, and the length of time on the wait list, as well as geographic area, to select the most suitable people to be placed at the top of the list, and the list is not short at all. If you look at the numbers here, you have a lot of people waiting for kidneys, and second to that is liver, and the list this is Ontario alone, right? It's as long as 1,622 people. So what that means is getting on the list is not going to guarantee you're gonna get a transplant. And then once you're on the list, you got to be prepared. Okay, prepare yourself, because the organ can become available at any time, and it is important to stay as healthy as possible. Now that's tricky. I mean, the person requiring a transplant, by definition, is probably very sick already. But you would try to stay as healthy as possible, and this is to ensure that the person is ready for the surgery, and also they're going to enhance the chance of recovering afterwards. There are many ways to manage your health while you're on the wait list. The transplant team and the primary care physician will usually come up with a plan for the patient to follow. Many patients waiting for heart and heart lungs or lung transplantation actually also face financial barriers in accessing the transplantation. That's because the patients, they often have to relocate in order to access the wait list. They have to receive ongoing assessment. The assessment is done periodically while the person is on the wait list, and even to have follow-up cares post-surgery, that will require a lot of financial support, and not everybody can afford that. And so there are some programs like the Transplant Patient Expense Reimbursement Program, the TPER program, that is funded by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, and it was created to relieve some of these financial burdens to patients. The program basically provides reimbursement to transplant patients for limited accommodation related expenses, and if the transplant hospital requires the patient to temporarily relocate closer to the transplant hospital in order to have the operation, then some of the costs might also be covered. Now let's look at the risks and challenges associated with organ transplant. The first obvious challenge is supply and demand. Requests or the demand for human organs and tissues usually exceed what is available or the supply. Significant practical and ethical issues regarding the efficiency and fairness arises as to how best to distribute these limited resources. And again, we will discuss this further in the ethical session. One of the reasons for a lack of supply is the issue of compatibility. As we learned in lecture 2, our immune system will reject and attack anything that does not belong to the body. So if you take a foreign organ, an organ from someone else, and put it in your body, they will be attacked, they will be rejected. And so it is not possible to get a 100% match when it comes to organ transplant, unless the donor and the recipients are identical twins. Okay, identical twins, they have the same cell identifiers on their on all their cells, and so it's going to be 100% match. But if you just take any two random people, then there are going to be differences in their cell markers, and that's what's resulting in the rejection. And so there are two compatibility tests that we have to consider before we do the transplant. There is the blood typing test and there's the tissue typing test. Blood typing is the first blood test that must show your blood and the recipient's blood is compatible or not. There are 4 blood types that are important to consider when it comes to organ transplant. These are A, B, AB, as well as O. So let's take a look at compatibility. Okay, so these AB and O, they refers to what kind of molecules are found on your cells. Okay, so for type A people, the surface is going to have we will call them A proteins. Okay. And you will make antibodies that would attack anything that doesn't belong to the body. So if you have A proteins in your body, you will make antibodies that would attack B. So we call it anti-B antibodies. And then if you are type B blood, then your surface protein is going to be B, and you will again make antibodies that would attack things that you don't have. So in this case, it will make anti-A antibodies. If you are AB blood, then you have both A and B on the surface, and so you will not be making any antibodies. You're not going to be making anti-A antibodies because you will end up attacking yourself. You will not be making anti-B antibody because again, you will end up attacking yourself. So in terms of the ABO blood group, if you are type AB blood, you will have no antibodies. Okay. If you are type O, then that means on your surface you have no proteins. Okay, type O means you have nothing, no A and no B. Then that means you are type O. Right? So because you don't have A and you don't have B, then the body will see both A and B as foreign. So you will be making antibody against A as well as antibody against B. So let's take a look at some examples. Let's say I want to take type A blood and give it to a type B person. Okay, is that okay? Well, when you give the type A to a type B person, the type B person, if I look at the chart here, the type B person is going to have the anti-A antibody. Okay, anti-A. So if you take the blood from an A person and give it to a type B person, the anti-A is going to attack them. Okay, and that's going to make it unsafe. Right? So let's take a look at another example. Let's say I have type A blood and I want to give it to an AB person. Is that going to be okay? Well, in the AB person, we have no antibodies. So when you give the A blood to this person, nothing is going to be rejected. Okay, they're not going to attack the incoming blood, and it's going to be safe. Okay, so in general, you can look at compatibility with this kind of quick way. If you're type O, you can give it to A, you can give it to AB, and then you can give it to B. Okay, so you just follow the arrow and it will tell you who you can give it to. If you are A, then you can give it to AB. Okay, if you're B, you can give it to AB. Okay, and AB can only give to other ABs. Okay, it's always okay to give to your own blood type, right? So if you take a look at here, for type A people, who can you receive from? Well, from type A people, you can receive from other type A, and then you can also receive from type O. Okay, and then you can donate to other A and AB. Okay, just follow the arrow, right? If you're a type B person, you can receive from B or O, and then you can donate to B or AB. If you are type AB, you can receive from everybody. Okay, but you can only donate to AB. Whereas if you are O, you can only receive from O, but you can donate to everybody. Okay, so that's the first compatibility test, okay? Which means if you have type A blood, okay, and you try to donate your kidney to someone with AB, then you pass the first test. Then you can go on to the next test, okay? If you are type A blood and you're trying to donate to someone who's type O, then it's not possible, right? They would have to find another donor. So that's the first test, the blood test. The next one is, once you pass the blood test, we do what's called tissue typing. Okay, in tissue typing, you have to try to you have to check to see how compatible something called the MHC markers are between the donors and the recipient. So MHC are basically these identifier markers that are found on the cells. It's a way that your immune system use to distinguish what belongs to the body and what does not. So a parent and a child would have at least 50% MHC matching. Okay, because as we learned earlier, we inherit half the genetic material from each parent, right? So we are going to be at least 50% MHC match with our parents, and then siblings they could have 0% match, okay, and that's really rare, okay. It's really rare that the half of the genetic material that I inherited from my mom is exactly the opposite half of what my sister has inherited from mom. Okay, usually there is some kind of overlap. Okay, but theoretically it can go as low as 0. And siblings, if they're identical twins, they could have as much as 100% match. Okay, so we want to have the MHC match percent as high as possible, because if the match is really low, then there is a high chance for the organ to be rejected. Okay, let's move on to ethics now. We will look at 3 ethical issues. First is allocation. How do you decide who gets the organ? And procurement. Where do we get the organ? And finally, consent. When it comes to allocation of the organ, the donated organ, the question here is, how do we choose who gets to receive the organ? Who should decide? The general consensus seems to be that it does not make sense to give a limited number of available organs to those who will not benefit, or to those who are expected to only live marginally longer, when others would greatly benefit, would have greater benefit from the transplant. While this criteria is widely accepted as fair, there is much discussion about how to define and assess the term benefit. Okay, that's rather vague term, right? For some people, even extra 1 month or 2 months, that's beneficial to them, right? But it's very subjective definition. Many argue that both expected length of survival and the possibility regarding rehabilitation should also be considered. Here are some definitive selection criteria. These are clear-cut criteria. For example, if your blood type don't match, then you cannot perform the transplant, period, right? There's no argument, there's no ethical concerns there, right? You cannot take a kidney from a type O person and give it, you cannot take a kidney from a type A person and give it to a type O person. It just won't work, right? So these are clear-cut criteria. Medical urgency, right? And also absence of other life-threatening diseases. These are also considered as definitive selection criteria. The more subjective criteria for selections that are more controversial includes the recipient's will to live, okay, motivations and ability to follow post-operative directions. Okay, for example, people have to take immunosuppressant drugs after the transplant to keep the immune system down, so that it minimizes the chance of rejection. Is the person going to be willing to comply with taking those medications? And the support from family, right? Is that available? Is that absent? That is also taken into consideration. And finally, something like even like the skill of the transplant team can also be relevant to the success of the transplant itself. So these things are kind of subjective, and it varies from places to places. So those are also taken into consideration. Here's an example of how health practitioners try to quantify kidney transplantation by using two parameters to calculate the probability of a successful kidney transplant. The EPTS score as well as the KDPI score. So the estimated post-transplant survival, or EPTS, is the score assigned to the recipient, and it is a measurement of how likely the person is going to reject the organ. So if there is a EPTS score of 20%, that means there is only a 20% chance of rejection. Okay, and if it's 100% score, that means it will for sure reject. So if you are a transplant recipient, you want the EPTS score to be low. Okay, you want it to be as low as possible. That means there is a very low chance of rejecting the organ. The EPTS score is calculated based on things like how long was the person on dialysis, which is something that you would do because your kidneys can't clean the blood anymore. So you have to do dialysis while you wait for the transplant. So the length of time that you spend on dialysis will determine how likely the organ the transplant will be successful. There is also consideration of current diagnosis of diabetes, prior transplant, as well as the age of the candidate. Okay, so they use all these things and they come up with a probability. The other score is for the donor. Okay, so this is called the KDPI score, the Kidney Donor Profile Index, and it measures how likely the organ will remain functional in the recipient. Okay, so if someone has a 20% score on the KDPI, that means it will function longer than 80% of all the kidneys. Okay, if you have a 70% score, that means the function will only be longer than 30% of the kidney. Okay, so again, you want this number to be as low as possible. Okay, like if you have a 1% score on the KDPI, it means this kidney will likely function longer than 99% of all the kidneys transplant out there. Okay, so both score, you want it to be as low as possible. So here is an example of how the two scores can be used. Someone with a EPTS score of less than 20% will receive offers for kidneys from donor with a KDPI score that is also less than 20%. Okay, and that means the donor's kidney will have a chance of lasting longer than 80% of all the kidneys, and it's going to be matched with someone who will have less than 20% chance of rejecting it. That's basically what the scores are for. Some argue in favor of using criteria such as social worth and merit or demerit to select or prioritize potential recipients. And here are some quick questions to think about along the line of social value, okay, merit and demerit. Is it fair to give priority to a mother of young children over a single person? Is it fair to give priority to a successful doctor over someone who is presently unemployed? Should someone who previously abused alcohol, smoked heavily, or ate unhealthily be denied a liver, lung, or heart transplant? Okay, so these are questions for you to think about. Okay. In Ontario, there used to be something called the 6 months rule for liver transplant, where a person has to be abstinent from alcohol for at least 6 months prior to receiving a liver transplant. So there are several headlines here. Liver transplant ethics. Should alcoholics be sober first? And you remember Delilah, right? She was denying the liver transplant because she, suffers from alcoholism. Here are some arguments for having this 6 months rule. Livers are scarce and finite resource, and study have shown that alcoholics are waiting for liver transplant and who are able to abstain from drinking for 6 months, they have a very low rate of returning to drinking. So the argument is that if they can hold off and not drink for 6 months, they are more likely to not drink after the transplant, and therefore it's more likely they will be able to keep the new liver functional. The opposing arguments against having the 6 month rule are the following. Okay, it goes against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which included universal access to health care. Okay, it doesn't say anything about your prior activities. Okay, you have the rights to have universal access to health care. The wait time, the 6 months, some argue it's too long. Patient could die before the 6 months before the 6 months, even though they're willing to comply with the absences. And the decision is very final. Okay, you cannot go back, right? There's no undoing. Okay, if the disease progress and it becomes worse over the course of 6 months while they're waiting, then they might miss the very narrow window of having a successful transplant. So let's think about a few hypothetical situations, right? If someone goes into a hospital bleeding to death from a gunshot wound, and then the doctors see that he's a gang member, and then the doctor said to him, according to our lifestyle policy, you have to wait 3 hours before we can treat you, and if you bleed to death in the meantime, well, too bad, you are a bad person, you are a gang, you deserve this. Or in another situation, if someone goes to the ER with a heart attack, and then the doctor found out that they haven't paid their taxes last year, so they will have to wait 3 hours before they will be treated. Right? Or if someone had a car accident and it's bleeding out, but then the doctor found out that they had a speeding ticket before, and so they will have to wait before getting treated. Right? So all these hypothetical situations might sound ridiculous to you, but that's what we are talking about with the abstinences rule here, right? The argument is that a person's past behavior should not be used to determine if they can immediately have a liver transplant or not. So in 2017, Ontario lifted the 6-month sober rule for liver transplant patients because new evidence suggests that having that extra 6 months of abstinences from alcohol does not actually improve the outcome of liver transplant patients, and so they no longer have to have that waiting period. Just one last thing about allocation. If all things are identical, if everything else related to age, to lifestyle, to disease progression, and expected outcome are the same, and even the genetics are the same, who should you give the organ to? Well, that's the case for these two girls. They are identical twins, and they were 3 years old at the time when they needed to have a liver transplant because of a genetic disorder they have. Without the transplant, they would both be expected to die, and so their adoptive father was happened to be a match to donate part of his liver, but he can only save one of them. So in this situation, how do you make a decision? How do you decide which of the two girls will get the liver? From a purely objective perspective, the doctor might look at things like which child has a higher chance of surviving if they receive the transplant. If they are likely to die within the same time without transplant, who will have a higher chance of success? If one twin needs the transplant more urgently over the other, then one option is to give her the transplant now and see if there is going to be another donor in the near future for the second twin. But if all things are identical, if all urgency and health factors between the girls are identical, then really the only thing left to do is for them to flip a coin and see, by let fate decide, so to speak, because from a medical perspective, everything else is the same. So more on that story later, but now let's switch to another topic. Let's look at the ethics of procurement. Procurement basically means, the source of the donated organ. So there has been many debates about whether one should be allowed legally to buy or sell organs. The proponents argue that if humans' organs and tissues are able to be bought and sold, then that will substantially increase the supply. And we should do that because organ donations are not happening at a high enough rate to meet the demands. And if people decided to sell their organs for money, that's their choice, and we should respect people's autonomy. That's the proponents' argument. The opponents would argue that treating the human body and its parts as commodities violates the human dignity. Now, it's worth noting that human tissues and organs are in fact being sold in some places, not always legally. For example, French pharmaceutical firms, they actually buy placentas. Placenta is the thing that connects the baby and the mother. And when the mother gives birth to the baby, the placenta comes out and usually is thrown away as a waste product. So pharmaceutical companies sometimes buy that from Canadian hospital in this case, and they use the cells from the placenta to manufacture things like vaccines and other blood product. In Mumbai, there has been cases where people got kidnapped, and when they regained consciousness, they found out that one of their kidneys has been removed while they were drugged. Presumably, the kidney would then be sold on the black market. So instances like these do happen. Now, back to the pharmaceutical company, right? That is perfectly legal thing to do. And then some people say, the placenta is a human waste product anyways. So, we shouldn't consider that as a selling of a human tissue or organ, because you're gonna be disposing it anyways. And things that can regenerate, such as blood, would be different compared to organs like kidneys. They don't regenerate. So in some places, in many places actually, people can sell their blood for money as part of the donation. Okay. And also, some people distinguish making a profit versus covering the donor's expense. So there are reimbursement program in Ontario for donors if they have to have out-of-pocket expenses for travel, parking, meals, accommodations, and loss of income as a result of the surgery, donation surgery. Then those are going to be covered, and then some expert and ethicists, they view that as okay, that's not making a profit, that's just covering the expenses. And another concern about buying and selling human organs is that people are concerned that only poor individuals, poor people, or people with low income would be willing to sell their organs, and these desperate individuals would do so without understanding the consequences of their actions, because they see this as the only way to have immediate income to help with their financial situation. So that would invalidate any free consent, and potentially it could go to the organ could go to the highest bidder, benefiting the most wealthy in the society. And in that regards, the equity would be violated, with the ability to pay rather than medical needs in determining the distribution of organs. Iran has a legal market for organs, and an article in the Los Angeles Times points out some of the shortcomings of the system. For example, sellers have learned that they can cut side deals to earn up to thousands more from well-off Iranians eager to bypass the roughly year-long waiting process for the legal transplant under the government system. And sometimes foreigners that are actually barred from the national programs, they are able to make side deals from these donors that are outside of the system. So, even though there is supposedly a legal venue of doing it, many people are not using it because they're able to make more money by doing it on the side. And you can see here in this picture, outside to one of the kidney transplant center in Tehran, there are many ads with people posting basically advertising that they are willing to donate their kidney, and they actually post their blood type here as well as a phone number, so that they could be reached. And that's an example of how even though there is a legal system, people are not necessarily going to be fully engaged in that. So you can read more about this story at the link over here. Let's switch gear and look at another issue with procurement, and that is the use of media publicity. So the good for using media publicity is that media pleads frequently brings in more volunteers than those required for the case being publicized. And media publicity also increases public awareness of the need for transplant, and so in the long run should increase the supply of donated tissues and organs. The bad side of media publicity, people argue that using social media, people could bypass the regular transplant channels, and they essentially bump themselves up in the transplant list, and they're selecting recipients for unavailable organs on the basis of greatest need and greatest likelihood of benefit. And the first come first serve model is basically all bypassed if they're able to use social media to get a donation. And another argument against using media publicity to secure an organ donation is that do we want to have a healthcare system where beautiful, good-looking, handsome, attractive, and tech-savvy, skillful people are able to get a donation, whereas other people don't, right? Are other people allowed to die because they're not as quote unquote sellable, because they don't have the technical skill to set up a web page, for example, or if the picture of a child is not as cute, so to speak, right? They don't tug the heartstrings of the public, right, so to speak, in quite the same way. So those are some of the things to consider. So remember the twin girls I showed you earlier, right? They both needed a liver transplant, and here is the adoptive parents. So the adoptive father, Michael Weiner, he was able to donate part of his liver, and in February 2015, that's what he did. Okay, as he left the decision to the doctors to decide which of the daughter would get the liver, and then the other twin was still in need of a donor. So the hunt was on for an anonymous benefactor. So they set up a Facebook page, and then that got a lot of media coverage, and resulted in hundreds of people applying to be the girl's donor. And ultimately, there was a happy ending to the story. Here is the donor, Chris Chung. He was 18 at the time and was majoring in English at Kingston Royal Military College. And Chung saw the story about the twins, and he said it pulled at his heart. And he found out that the adoptive father also served in the military, and that kind of sealed the deal for him. And he donated part of his liver, and essentially saved the life of the other twin. And after receiving the transplant, the girls are, for the most part, living a healthy life, and they were able to start a school after the life-saving transplant. Another issue with procurement is something called transplant tourism. Transplant tourism involves not only the purchase and sales of organs, but also other elements related to the commercialization of organ transplant. And basically, it means that people from one country will go travel to another country, where they're going to be able to purchase an organ from someone. And usually this is arranged or facilitated by some kind of intermediaries and healthcare providers, who will be responsible for procuring the organ. But this is often not a legal thing to do, and you don't know where the organ is coming from. And the internet has often been used to attract foreign patients. Several websites offer these all-inclusive transplant package. And the price of renal transplant package ranges from 70,000 to 160,000 US dollars. And here is such a website, and it's actually banned a website, because this is illegal activity. But you can still see some of the countries where the transplants are taking place and the relative cost for this. And before we move into to consent, just another quick word about transplant tourism. It's obviously not a good thing to do, because a lot of times you don't know where the organ is coming from, and there might be a high chance of rejection, and when you go back to your own country after the transplant, the follow-up healthcare team might not be able to help you, because they don't know the source of the organ, and then the medical history associated with all these things, and so as a result, transplant tourism is it's a big concern. But sometimes people are desperate, right? That's the only way for them to get an organ, and if they have a chance of getting it, otherwise they would die. Some people are willing to take the risk. All right, let's move on to consent. There are three types of consent related to organ transplant: voluntary or expressed, family, or presumed. In voluntary or expressed consent, it involves a person making known their free offer to donate one or more of their organs and or bodily tissue after they have died or while alive. So in the case of Ontario, you would do your voluntary consent through registering on the beadonor.ca website, right, run by the Trillium Foundation, the Gift of Life Foundation. And in family consent, what happens is, if a person did not clearly express voluntary consent, and then they pass away, then the family or the person lawfully responsible for the body of the deceased may be approached regarding the donation. And this is the consent that you have to check off when you register to be a disease donor on the Trillium Gift of Life website. And basically, that is a form of expressed consent. There is also another type of consent which is presumed, and in countries like France, Belgium, and several other countries, they have various forms of presumed consent legislation in place. So what that means is, by default, people are assumed to be willing to donate their organs when they die. Okay, and if you don't want to do it, you kind of have to opt out of the process. Okay, whereas compared to Ontario, by default, we assume people don't want to donate their organs, and if you wish to do it, you have to opt in. Okay, so there are ethical concerns related to the presumed consent approach. Should minor and mentally disabled individuals be included in the presumed consent? To what extent should healthcare profession check to see if a person has expressed a wish to not to donate, right? Should they go through vigorous investigation to find out if the person has opt out of the program, or could they be turning a blind eye, so to speak, and just go ahead with a donation? Is this a form of exploiting human ignorance and weaknesses? So all these are questions, ethical concerns that are valid related to presumed consent. In 2019, Nova Scotia is set to become the first in North America to switch to a presumed consent for organ donation. Now, does that actually help by switching to presumed consent? Do you actually get more donations? Well, it depends. Some countries reported 20 to 30 times increase in organ donation rates after the switch. But places like France and Brazil, they actually saw a decrease in donation afterwards. And in Sweden, the rate actually remained the same after they switched. So there are perhaps many other factors that are in play other than just switching the type of consent. And there was a case in Hong Kong. There was a dying mother who needs to receive a liver, and her daughter was a good match for the liver donation, but she was 17 at the time, and was told that she was too young to be able to make a decision to basically give consent. Okay, the consenting age for Hong Kong is 18 years old, and she was just months away from her birthday. And unfortunately, the mother died by the time she turned 18. And so, based on these kind of stories, it makes you wonder if we should change the consenting age. Just like vaccines, for example, vaccine consent, as long as the person is capable of making such decision based on information that is presented to them, perhaps we should let them make such decision. And just to wrap up the lecture, we talked about these. I asked you to think about these true or false questions at the beginning of the lesson, and let's go through them. So a signed donor card is all you need to become a donor. Well, that's not true, right? There is no signed donor card anymore. This used to be a thing in Ontario, but now they have switched to the online registration, right? The beadonor.ca, that website, right? Or you can register at Service Ontario. Next, I cannot be a donor because I have a serious medical condition. It depends on the medical condition itself, right? So just because you cannot donate one organ, it doesn't affect the ability for you to donate others, right? And there's also options for tissue donation as well. So you really don't know, and you need to speak to a doctor before you find out. So that's false. Organ donation will delay and impact my funeral plans. So that is also not true. The people who are handling the donation process know that it's a very sensitive time for the family who has lost a loved one, and they treat the body with dignity, and they will process it as quickly as possible, and it will not be impacting the funeral plans. And lastly, I cannot donate blood, so I cannot be an organ donor. The criteria for blood donation is actually different from the criteria for organ donation. So just because you are not eligible to donate blood, for example, because of low iron, that doesn't mean you cannot be an organ donor. Okay, so hopefully you learn more about organ transplantation, and next week we will talk about another disease and another group of diseases that has significantly reduced the life expectancy of humans, and that is cancer. Okay, so I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.